All right. 7:01, here we go. I told Joey, I said that sugar's going to kick in about 10 minutes. Exodus is supposed to be a 50-something week Bible study, and it'll be done by 7:30. Jeannie going to have to say, pump the brakes, Chad, and slow down. It'd be like that night I drank 3 glasses of sweet tea before I talked. All right. We continue in Exodus. And y'all, I wish so much we could just fast forward to the geography lesson night, but I'm like holding myself back because I can't wait to get there. But I'm so excited about that night that we're going to have together. But in the meantime, we got to get there, and we got to plow through some good scripture in the process. Last week, we spent quite a bit of time talking about, and we introduced the Bible study by looking at a secondary account of Moses' life from the prophet or from the disciple Stephen. And inside that account, we saw some things that were a little bit different. Not that they were in discrepancies, but they were different in how the culture looked at how Moses and the lineage of Moses and the lifestyle and who Moses was to them as a people group looked differently. And so tonight we're going to pick up a little bit more on that, and we're going to study Moses specifically because we're going to really get into just talking about Moses is going to come up so much now moving forward that we really need to understand who that man was. Just as an example, inside the Old Testament, Moses is mentioned 768 times. Inside the New Testament, he's mentioned 80 times. So you can imagine the direct call-outs, a little bit more than 10% of the time in the New Testament. So he's a vital picture of what the Old Testament looks like, and we'll talk about that tonight some. And then we talked about Moses leaving Egypt. We discussed the circumstances that he found himself in when he killed the Egyptian slave, the whip master that was beating the slave. And he ended up killing that man, hiding his body in the sand. And then he left because it was found out by 2 other slaves, and he knew that Pharaoh would essentially find out and probably have him killed. And then we see Moses interacting with the burning bush. And whenever we see Moses interacting with the burning bush, where did we see that occur? On what mountain? Mount Horeb, which is also known as Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, which is also known as modern-day Jabal Maqla, which is in modern-day Saudi Arabia, is the best estimate we have. That we talked last week about the 2 ideas that primarily stem on how people traveled out of Egypt. Did we talk about that? Did we talk about the Egypt theory and the Hebrew theory? Did we discuss that? Oh, okay. Well, let's catch up on that real quick. Just so you guys know, there are 2 primary theories of how the Egyptian Exodus occurred, and the 2 primary theories are associated with how they left Egypt and the Red Sea. So there is one theory that says they left crossing the Sea of Reeds, and then they moved down the finger of the Red Sea, and then they just on the eastern side of the Red Sea that was closest to Egypt, and then they would actually come down and they moved around the Gulf of the Sin Desert. Yes, I do. Egypt, Exodus. Thank you, Kelly. So let's see if this will pull up. Yeah, here it is. So this is the land of Goshen. We knew that the 2 cities that they were working on were here, the 2 storage cities. And then you have a small Sea of Reeds, as it's known here. And then this is the actual, there's another small lake here, and then it enters the Gulf of the Suez, or what is known as the Red Sea. And so the 2 theories is that, one, they moved across the Sea of Reeds, and they came down this route that you see here. And then they came over this route down to the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba, and then they moved up into the land of Midian as we know it today. The other theory, that's called the Egypt theory, by the way. That's formally speaking as scholars speak of it in universities. That's how they refer to it, as the Egypt theory. And then the Hebrew theory is that they came out of the land of Goshen, and instead of going the way of the Philistines, which is this route that you see here, they went this route that you see here, and they would have crossed into the Midian territory here, came down to the Gulf of Aqaba, and then they would have crossed at one of 3 points at the Gulf of Aqaba, either here at the top, here at the Nuebe beach, or here at the Gulf, the entry to the Gulf that you see here, and then they would have entered into Midian, what is today known as Midian and what is Jabal Makla. So there is a believed Mount Sinai here, where my finger is on the screen, and then the traditional Mount Sinai, which was established by the wife of Constantine, or the mother of Constantine, is here in the desert of Sin. Okay? So if you were to... Sir? Then, yeah, all the archaeologists have said, you find me one chariot wheel in the Gulf of Aqaba, and we'll change the whole, we'll blow the whole Egypt theory out the window. That's all they want, is one wheel to be excavated and found. So we'll study that as we get going down that path later on. But those are the two primary theories. And then we studied about the people groups that were in this area. This is, just as a reminder from last week, these are the Canaanite tribes that they were going after eventually into the Promised Land. And then we see where Moses at Mount Horeb, and if we go back over here, so if you're an Egypt theory person, Mount Horeb would be somewhere in the wilderness of Sin here. If you're a Hebrew Exodus theory, then Mount Horeb, the mountain of Sinai, would be somewhere over in what is modern day Midian. Okay? So there's, ma'am, modern day Midian / Saudi Arabia. So those are the two places. Did I confuse anybody by that? Everybody good? Okay. So if we come back now and we look at what are we going to do tonight, we're going to study a profile of who Moses was. We're going to look at how God was preparing Moses for the task, and then we're going to look at Moses working with the people to prepare their heart, or specifically God working with Moses to prepare his heart to go do what he needed to do. And so as we do this, one of the things that we're going to look at is what Moses looked like as an individual. And so to do that, what I did is I took a survey of the 800 plus verses, and I tried to develop a character profile, much like you would make up a profile as someone that was being investigated. We used to have to do investigations on people at the bank that I worked for, and we would do digital makeups of people, and we would do digital recovery of information so that we could understand who are we dealing with, who is the person that is supposedly breaking into the bank, and all those kind of things. So that is what I essentially did, is I applied that same methodology to what do we do with Moses. And so when you think about Moses, when you look at Scripture, I want you to get two things in your mind, and I've broken them into two sections here. First, the character of Moses holistically. Moses was born to a mother in slavery, right? His mother was was a slave. She was a descendant of a slave. Her mother was a descendant of the slave, and so on and so forth for probably 3 to 4 generations at minimum at this point, or more. He was born under the edict of Pharaoh that all the male babies had to be killed. You remember that? So what was around him up until he was 3 months old was this understanding that most likely he is one of the few Hebrew children within a time period of, we don't know how long that edict from Pharaoh lasted, but that all the male babies would be killed. He was an anomaly. Does that make sense? As he aged, he became somewhat of an anomaly, that he was who he was and where he was from. But then we also see the Scripture says that his mother abandoned him into the Nile River. Isn't that interesting to think about? We always read, she placed him. He was placed in a basket, those kind of things. And then when you think about the Nile, Pharaoh's daughter was the one that drew him out of the Nile. And I really hadn't thought about this, quite frankly, till this past week as I was working on this in more detail. And what I do is I'm about 5 or 6 chapters ahead of where we are, but then I really dig in each week to making this stuff up inside the Bible study. And it hit me for a second, and I thought, what's his Hebrew name? Have you ever thought about that for a second? I just naturally thought, for some reason, I thought Moses was his Hebrew name. But who named him? Pharaoh's daughter. And it's like, well, that's interesting. Yes, we have the Hebrew translation of whatever his name was. Moses, the one that was drew out, she actually named him. If you remember, Moses' name was the one drawn out of the water, the Nile. And for all of my life, I've never realized that. Is that something new, or is it just me, or have y'all? I always thought that's his Hebrew name. That's his Egyptian name. It just is translated into Hebrew, and we get to see that. So I don't know what Moses' Hebrew name was really. His Hebrew name, as we know it in the Bible, is Moshe. That is the one drawn out. But I think that's just captivating to me all of a sudden, that I was like, wow, that's interesting. And now all of a sudden we see Moses being raised inside the Pharaoh's household. Now he is being raised alongside the rest of Pharaoh's children. We know of one, his Ramses, it's presumed Ramses. Actually, it's not presumed Ramses. There's multiple presumptions of who the Pharaoh is at this time. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want you to know that in case somebody came to you and said, well, which Pharaoh was it? Well, the truth of the matter is none of us can tell you who it is. We can research the fool out of it. We can go as far back in history as we possibly can. We can study all kinds of documents, but ultimately we cannot nail down exactly who the Pharaoh was at the time of the Exodus. There are 2 highly likely candidates, Amenhotep III and then Ramses II, but we cannot with 100% conclusivity say this is the one, okay? That is not what is important, though. I'm not excusing that fact. People would say, well, that's great that you have the opportunity to just excuse that and think that it goes along. I'm not saying that at all, but what I am advocating is that he's not the focus of the story. This is about the redemption of God, of the people of Israel, to bring them out to the wilderness to enter into a marriage ceremony with them. And so now what we see is Moses is raised inside this place. And look at this in Matthew 19:8. Moses spoke as the very voice of God, even though he did not at times receive the exact command from God. And let's just look at a couple of these verses together. We won't go into detail on each of these. Matthew 19:8. He said to them, Moses, with reference to your hardness of heart, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not like this. And that's Jesus speaking to a group of people that was documented by the Apostle Matthew. Moses spoke as whom? As God. Isn't that interesting? Moses would be labeled as a prophet. Moses would be labeled as a leader of the children of Israel. But what I want you to see is that we begin for the first time to see an image in Scripture tonight that we're going to be studying of Moses being put in the place of an Elohim to Pharaoh. Because keep in mind, what was the role of Pharaoh as we studied Egyptology together a little bit? Pharaoh was a god. And so as a god, he was looked at as the one that kept everything, the ecosystem of Egypt, in check. And now what we see is all of a sudden that Moses as a god comes to combat a god. Does that make sense? And we see Aaron acting on behalf of Moses almost as if a priest acting on behalf of Pharaoh or anybody else. So there's a deliberate structure of how the people are seen and how the interactions occur here. And I think that's absolutely amazing that we see that God puts himself even above Pharaoh by assigning a, quote, lesser god. Does that make sense? And then that combats him. It would be like the President of the United States saying, I'm not going to come meet with you, Mr. Dictator of some foreign country. I'll send to you my Secretary of State, or the Vice President might come to visit you, but I'm not going to step down and come visit you. Does that make sense? So Moses in some way, though, this next bullet point, Moses in some way understands the basis of the Hebrew religion, even though he was raised in the household of Pharaoh. Somehow what we see through Scripture is that Moses, even though he was raised around Egyptian gods, raised by Egyptian parents, was indoctrinated with their religion, he somehow still has a knowledge of who God is, the God of the Hebrews. And then the question becomes, well, how? Why would he have that knowledge? And the concept behind that is that we understand that Moses was raised and educated within Pharaoh's home. And because he was raised and educated, just like somebody that would be raised and educated in society today, if there were multiple languages being spoken and you were being groomed to be a leader, how many languages would you most likely want to learn? Both of them. Also interesting is that you begin to see, well, maybe Moses, he's also learning about their religion. Because what we're going to find out is, and this is something that I was not raised in felt board Sunday school, as I like to call it, of understanding who Moses was. But Moses was not just a man walking around with Egyptian armor on or what have you. He was a warrior for Egypt, and he was a leader inside the Egyptian society. And that becomes very captivating as you begin to study Scripture and see that, and you go, oh, well, that opens up an entirely new dynamic for me about who Moses is, because now it makes I begin to understand how he was torn between two worlds, because he obviously didn't look 100% Egyptian, right? I mean, there are distinctive facial differences between them. It's not the movie, the Cecil DeMille movie, what's that called? The Exodus or whatever it's called? Where you've got Charlton Heston and you've got the guy that plays Ramses. You both don't have hair. They both got shaved heads and ponytails hanging off the side kind of thing. And so now what happens is we begin to understand that Moses in some way understands that religion, but also look at this. Moses becomes seen as an archetype, archetype means he looks like, he's set up to be like the Messiah. And you say, hold on, Chad, what, are they really that into this Moses guy? They reviled him and said, you are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moshe. We know that God has spoken to Moshe, but we do not know where this man is from. This is the people that were criticizing Jesus and the disciples of Jesus. This is the Pharisees and the scribes talking about that. Over and over again, we see in Scripture it testifying to who Moses was and his role. And he was looked at primarily as the deliverer. When you think about Moses' role in Israel's society, from an antiquity, from a historical standpoint, they viewed Moses as their deliverer. Well, what is Jesus? Our deliverer, right? And so there is a distinct parallel that we see between these two, this archetype of Moses being looked at as a Messiah. Moses was strong in word and deed. I thought this one was really interesting. I think I actually, let me see. In Acts, that is, Moses was strong in words and deed, is an exact cut and paste out of the Bible. That's from Acts 7:20. When you were raised in church or felt board Sunday school, how were you told, what was Moses' primary struggle? His speech. What does it say here? Strong in word and deed. If Moses was raised as a leader in Egypt, do you think he probably stammered, really? Or do you think he was nervous at some point and felt for his life that as he came back to Pharaoh from the burning bush, do we know that Moses felt fear when he came back from the burning bush? We haven't got there yet, but yes, Moses was absolutely scared to death to go back to Egypt. I'm not a man of good words, he would say. Something happened to Moses at some point that we see that occurred. But what we're looking at here is a Jewish recounting of who Moses was. And it says Moses was strong in word and deed. Does this mean that he couldn't speak well? I struggle with that now. I struggle with... I think that is absolutely legitimate. I think also one of the things that I thought about this week is I thought about strong in word and deed. He knew who he was in Egyptian society. So even though he knew he could command, there's only, I'm not Egyptian, I can't relate fully. I think about Arnold Schwarzenegger. I don't know why I think about that. But you think about Arnold Schwarzenegger and he's like, he's governor of, California, and you're thinking, yeah, but you don't even talk like the rest of us kind of thing, right? Strong in word and deed. I don't know. Maybe that's not it, but that's what comes to mind for me. Yeah, that's right. But also we need to keep in mind, yes.
Mine says he was powerful. Actually, it's 22, and it says he was powerful in both speech and action.
Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? But yet we oftentimes see that he's portrayed as not. And then the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that he was considered part of the wealthy class, which means he could read and write. Now, this is something that I've never studied before until this time as well, is that in Egypt, hieroglyphs had some like over 1,100 symbols that you would have to memorize to be able to write and read in Egyptian. 1,100 symbols to be able to accurately discern a text in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Do you think the layperson could easily learn Egyptian? I could probably speak it, but it's a whole nother thing to be able to write it or to read it, right, with 1,100 symbols. I got on a rabbit trail this week, and I won't take y'all all the way down it. We may talk about it at some point. But I studied the origins of the English alphabet as we know it. Because what happens is that it's intrinsically tied, English is intrinsically tied back to the Phoenician alphabet, which is intrinsically tied back to, and that's the argument, was it Phoenician first or was it Hebrew first? And so there's a huge argument that goes back to that, and you say, well, why is that important? Because do you know who they attribute the creation of the Hebrew alphabet to? Moshe. Isn't that interesting? I've never heard that before that I've grown up in church. I think, well, that's interesting. They would even, because whenever they left, and would it make sense that somebody like Moses, a man trained in Egyptian, and with the schools and the capability to understand hieroglyphs and all those kind of things, for him to be able to take something and create a 26-letter or 27-letter alphabet off of it, and think about what 1,100 alphabetical symbols does to a language versus 27. Does that make sense to you, the significance of that? From a speech, from a reading, from a writing standpoint? That Hebrew language literally revolutionized the scripture as we know it, but it also revolutionized history because of possibly this man we're studying. Literally, that people debate this heavily inside the scholarly realms of where did Hebrew 1.0 come from? There actually is about 4 different or so Hebrew languages that you can trace back historically speaking. One of them is the furthest back they can find is the Hebrew letter Aleph. It's the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And it actually, in the ancient of ancient, it is the symbol of a bull's head, is the letter. Well, hold on. Where do we get bull's head kind of pictures from? Egypt? Perhaps Egypt? The Phoenicians, Egyptian? What is that? Where that could? And so what you see is the letter in the Hebrew alphabet that is Aleph is actually a morphing of that bull's head, literally. Over time, you can literally see the morphing of the character come out of that. That to me is absolutely fascinating when we look at who this man is that we're studying. And then Moses fathered 2 sons in Midian by Zipporah, Gershom and Eleazar. We see Gershom here in a little bit. We'll actually see that in our story hopefully tonight. But then I will go back and tell you, whenever we study New Testament scripture about Moses, one of the complaints is, and we read that earlier, it said that Moses gave you a certificate of what? Divorce. In scripture it says that, right? Didn't say God gave that to you. How many wives did Moses have? Do you know? 2. And you're like, oh, hold on now. Hold on. I thought we were good Jewish people and we didn't get divorced. And if the husband died, then the brother took the husband's wife and married her as well so she would not be brought up in shame. Do you know that? That's actually a very historical Jewish tradition. And so you consider this and you go, hold on, Moses had 2 wives. And we're going to get to a really cool story in a little while where Jethro, Zipporah's dad, actually brings Zipporah and the kids to Moses because he says, I'm done with them. And that is such a cool story that's hidden inside of our text of our Bible that I can't wait till we get to. But I've never thought about Moses had two wives. And I would advocate to you this. He didn't like Zipporah very much, in my opinion. I mean, no wonder he married that second girl, because she was a Cushite and she had something cushy going on or something, because what was going on with Zipporah did not go over well, because they did not like each other at all. Here in just a few minutes, you're going to see the first text where you're going to see Zipporah and you're going to be like, woo, she did not like him in the least bit. There ain't no way she recovered from that fight. That fight went deep. That stake went deep in that relationship. And you see it from that point forward in Scripture. You see the relationship of Moses and Zipporah tainted from that point forward. Those who sinned, this was interesting to me. Those who sinned before the law was given to Moses were held to a different standard. And I never picked up on this before. Look at this. But death reigned from, this is from Romans 5. But death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who did not sin in their likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of the one who is to come. So you say, hold on. What does that mean? Moses is a type of who? Christ, a Messiah. Do you see that in the verse? That's what it's saying. That's what the verse is saying. The verse is saying that he is a type of the one who is to come. But the gift is not like the trespass. For if by the trespass of the one, Adam, the many died, the ones leading up to Moses, by much more did the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, multiply to many. So literally something from the spiritual realm is affected from the time of Moses backwards to the creation time and after Moses to Jesus. Do you see that in Scripture? Do you understand what I'm saying there? That literally something, sin is looked at differently up until the time of Moses. And then there is a definition of sin that is created at what event? The 10 Commandments. I mean, this is like a defining moment in human history is what we're seeing there. And then we already talked. Moses was married twice. He had 2 father-in-laws. They're actually documented, Jethro and Hobab. How about that for a name? I can't say much. My grandfather's name was Ponto. So, I mean, how do you come up with that one? My kids are lucky. I didn't name one of them Ponto. I don't know which one I'd name Ponto, but I'd come up with one, I think. But Moses on multiple occasions was compassionate also toward the Egyptians and the Israelites. We see that throughout Scripture, right? In the Scripture, we see that he was compassionate toward the Israelites. The first one, the one that was being beat. We see that he is compassionate toward the Egyptians during the plagues. We'll actually read that. We'll see that Moses is compassionate toward the Israelites and actually steps between the wrath of God, where he says, I'm going to smoke every one of them people I brought out of Egypt. And Moses is like, no, Lord, if you do that, this is not going to be good for your name. Okay? And so now what we see is this. Moses begins this process of being an intercessor. And then this is where we think about the whole Hebrew language thing I've already covered. So let's look at this for just a moment through Scripture. Now let's think for a moment, using Scripture as a guide, what Moses could have been handed down from his ancestry about Yahweh. In Exodus 4:5, it says, he was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Who states that? Moses does. So he understands something of his Israelite Hebrew culture. We're not aware of any written documents that could have been handed down from one generation to the next during the time of the slavery of Egypt. We literally, y'all, have zero documentation of an Israeli or Hebrew alphabet before the time of Moses. Think about that for just a second. That's like, holy cow. Then look at the time period. I thought, well, how far away was this? What's the time periods we're dealing with? Based on biblical calendar that you would generally be acceptable, it's debated heavily. We see that creation was somewhere around 13,652 BC as the life of Adam. The life of Abraham was around 2,166 BC. Do you see that? I mean, that's like 11,000 years. And it's like, what in the world of human history, the impact of that? Of the Garden of Eden to 11,000 years to Abraham. Then around 1700 BC, another 400 years, we see Jacob goes to Egypt. Now we're getting in some time periods that we can really start to put, some tangible evidence around. And then around 1275, the Israelites leave Egypt. Look at the span of history, y'all. 400 and something years, but look at the span of history without any written document to be giving you a context to operate your, quote, religion off of. Do you see how significant that is to them as a culture? And so now we are unaware of how, if God spoke to the Hebrew people in Egypt after the death of Joseph. We have no documentation showing to us that God spoke orally in a way that anybody as a slave in Egypt understood. Do you understand what I'm trying to say there? Do you see the confusion and the aggravation and the crying out that we talked about? Consider this also. This priest of Midian. Remember, who is Jethro? He's labeled a priest of Midian. Is that not who he's labeled? Who was he? The Midian people were descendants from Abraham through one of his wives, through his sixth wife. The Jethro in Midian was a descendant through his wife named Keturah, and he was one of the six sons of Keturah. So think about this. When did Yahweh come onto the scene, historically speaking, from an Abraham standpoint? Somewhere before 1700 BC, right? You see the timeline there? Abraham heard from God and was considered righteous before God because he obeyed God. Is that how Scripture lays it out? So somehow Abraham, with no proven documented source that we can find, handed down his religion of Yahweh to the Midianites through Keturah, to Jethro's clan, and Jethro becomes a priest of Midian. Now, Moses' life was divided into three primarily equal segments, busted up in 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian as a shepherd, and then 40 years in the Exodus, right? So he spent 40 years with who in the desert? Jethro, the priest of Midian, at the mountain of God, because that's where the Midianite culture was, and that's where they raised their sheep. And so you ask yourself, from a timeline of Moses, and you say, okay, Chad, tonight you told us that he was raised in Pharaoh's household for how many years? 40 years. He learns the faith of Yahweh from probably whom? A little bit from Egypt, but he sees it exercised most likely in who? In Jethro. most likely in Jethro. And then he exits and comes back, and he comes into the third season of his life where he's interacting with the people of God who are slaves for 400 years. Does that puzzle start to come together at all for you there? Okay, so let's get going. We re-enter the story tonight at chapter 4. Recall, Moses is speaking with the angel of the Lord at the burning bush in Midian at Mount Sinai. Okay, that's where we're coming back to. And Moses answered to the burning bush, and he said, and if they do not believe me, and they do not listen to my voice, but they say, Yahweh did not appear to you. Think for just a moment about Moses is talked about in other pieces of Scripture and paint the best possible picture of what his personality was like, which we just did. We know that Moses from Scripture was a skilled leader raised in the house of Pharaoh until about the age of 40. And now all of a sudden he's beginning to get nervous about, what if they don't believe me? I'm the son that should have been raised a slave, but I was the privileged prep school kid that got raised in Pharaoh's household. Do you see the dynamic there, the social dynamic coming into play? And Yahweh said to him, what is this in your hand? He's got some kind of shepherd's staff. And he said, a staff? And he said, throw it on the ground. And he throws it on the ground. And when he threw it on the ground, it became a snake. And Moses did what? He says he ran from it. I would have too. I would have hollered, get a hoe. Do something. Get a shovel. Something like that. But Moses says he just took off running. Has Moses got shoes on? No. Isn't that interesting to think about for a second? Moses ain't got a sandal on, and he gets up and starts boogieing. Boo, 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 boo. And can you imagine being in the burning bush for just a second? Because this is what's happening, right? Imagine that burning bush is right here in the middle of the room, and I've got this staff here, and the burning bush tells me, which is already crazy enough that I'm talking to a burning bush, and I throw the staff down, and when I throw the staff down, it turns into a snake, and I just take off running. What's the cat doing in the burning bush? He's looking at the angel of the Lord's going, well, where are you going? Hold on, this is the whole purpose. Stay around for a minute. I'm going to show you something. God has got to have a huge sense of laughter, right? He's like, I'm going to tell him to pick it up next. He's going to love this one. And so he threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and Moses fled from it. And Yahweh said to Moses, hey. Moses sticks his head out from behind the rock. Is that snake still on the ground? And he says, reach out your hand and grasp it. And he says, you crazy? You bumped your head. And grab it by its tail. And he reached out his hand and grabbed it, and it became a staff in his palm. So he's shoeless and grabbing snakes. So that they may believe that Yahweh, the God of their ancestors, appeared to you, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So here we go. He says, and Yahweh said to him again, put your hand in the fold of your garment. And he put his hand in the fold of the garment, and he took it out, and to his surprise, his hand was afflicted with a skin disease like snow. My dad has this in certain parts of his body. I used to have a part on my body, but it's called vitiligo. Have y'all ever seen it before? I'll show it to you. It comes in, do what? Yes, I know. You see the hands here? And you see around the face the white spot? It's a lack of pigment. My dad can't stand going to the beach because there's no pigment there, and it's heat straight on the bone almost. And so it just hurts. There's many people that suffer from this, you can suffer from it at times, and sometimes you don't even know it's there. A lot of women cover it up with makeup, but it's called vitiligo. But that is essentially what you see, right? Look at that hand on the right. What does it look like? It's covered up. Hold on, let me see. You see the hands? Vitiligo, okay? And so imagine him putting his hand in, and he pulls it out, and he's like, what in the world? Put it back in. And he said, return your hand, thank God, and to the fold of the garment. And he returned his hand to the fold of the garment, and he took it out of the fold, and to Moses' surprise, it was restored like the rest of his body. And if they do not believe you, and if they will not listen to the voice of the former sign, then they will believe the voice of the latter sign. The voice? Did the snake speak? Did the hand speak? No, the voice was a testament to what God is saying. This man is mine. And if they also do not believe the second of these signs, and they will not listen to your voice, then you must take water from the Nile, look at this, and pour it on dry ground. And the water that you take from the Nile will become blood on the ground only. Hold on a second. I thought that the Nile turned blood as one of the plagues. It did. But it also, this is a sign that God says, use this as a sign to show them. Blood and water are distinctly different substances, right? You pour blood out, you know it's blood on the ground compared to water. This is not red water. And the reason I use that as an example with you is that one of the ways that people who follow the typical Egyptian Exodus theory, they excused away the miracles of the Exodus through naturalistic occurrences. So in other words, the blood in the Nile was not really blood. What it was a rainstorm that came down into the Ethiopian area of Egypt, or of that area of the country, and it would have caused the Nile to turn red because the water would have pushed over red clay, and it would have tainted the river red. So it really wasn't blood. It was just colored like blood. They would also excuse away the Egyptian Exodus to say, oh, well, they really didn't cross a sea. They crossed a sea of reeds, which was a marshland. And that's whenever the one guy gets all excited and says, that's amazing. And they're like, what do you mean that's amazing? That all those Egyptian soldiers and chariots could die in the sea of reeds, in a marsh, that they could be covered up. The other theory is that the hand of God, the breath of God did not actually separate the Red Sea, but rather it was a natural phenomenon that actually occurs, the downdraft of wind to allow water to be split, which can happen. Now, to what depths, I would argue, but it can actually happen and push water away like in a tide moving almost. Yes, ma'am.
I was told by a physical science teacher at Florida University that the way it happened was a volcano erupted and caused
A rift.
Yes.
Yes.
When it drew back the water for the tsunami,
Yeah.
that's when the people
Yeah.
crossed and then the tsunami came through and washed.
Yeah, that's also where they get the cloud. That's the exact same argument, the volcano argument, of the ash that was produced from that cloud to be the pillar that separated the Egyptians from the Israelite at the Red Sea crossing. So what they're doing is they're using, and people will straddle a line when it comes to that, and they'll say, oh, naturalistically, yes, it was still a miracle. Well, what do you mean? Well, God caused that volcano to do that at the exact moment in time that it needed to be done. And what they do is they excuse away the capability of God to physically alter the environment that has been created. And that's how the scientists deal with that. Okay? And there's multiple examples as we get to the Red Sea crossing that I'll share with you. There are other examples of that. And so here we see the Nile being turned into blood before the plague, specifically water from the Nile being poured out. And Moses said to Yahweh, please, Lord, I am not a man of words, neither recently nor in past, nor since you're speaking. Seems contradictory a little bit, right, to Acts? To your servant, because I am heavy of mouth and of tongue. Hence where people get he must have stuttered or stammered or had a speech slur or something else. I can't explain this to you. I don't have I'm just telling you these are what the scriptures say, okay? He is. Yeah, why not? Yeah. I mean, he's 80. I mean, he's had a lot to drink. I mean, who knows? Yeah. And Yahweh said to him, who gave a mouth to humankind? Doesn't it sound like Yahweh and Job? Remember the book of Job, book of Job? And who makes mute or deaf or sighted or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? So then go, and I myself will be your mouth, and I will teach you what you must speak. When have we seen Yahweh say this in the New Testament? He says it to the apostles. He says, do not worry about what you will say whenever you're brought before people. I will give you what to say. Isn't that true? And he said, verse 13, please, Lord, do send anyone else whom you wish to send. And at that point, if I was in the bush, I would say, Moses, is there anybody else around this bush? And Yahweh was angry with Moses and said, is that not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? God was angry. Remember when we studied God and whenever he gets angry, how does it reflect God's anger? What causes it to flare? His nostrils flare in anger. I know that he certainly can speak, and also there he is coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he will rejoice in his heart. Ooh, Aaron? Where did Aaron come from? Egypt. Hold on. Did Moses leave like breadcrumb markers? He's been there 40 years. How did they get news that Moses was in Midian? How did Aaron know where to go? Because Aaron is the brother, right? He was born to the mother of Moses. He's the brother of Miriam. You catch my drift? How does he know to come all this way? Yeah, how does this happen? So obviously whatever the age difference is, Landy, to your question, obviously whatever the age difference is between Moses and Aaron, the edict from Pharaoh's gone. And so he says, and said, is it not Aaron your brother I see? And he will speak to him, 16, and he will speak for you to the people, and then he will be to you as a mouth, and you will be to him as a God, and you must take this staff in your hand with which you will do the signs. It just hit me as well, Landy, that we also know that at this time that the pharaohs, that there's a change in the kingship as well. That just occurred to me, sorry. And 18, and Moses went and he returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, with Aaron, and he says to Jethro, please let me go and let me return to my brothers who are in Egypt. So he's not scared to go back to Pharaoh, possibly. I mean, or else he's gotten courage all of a sudden. And let me see whether they are alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. I mean, Moses has got his grandkids. He's got support. Go in peace. Back to where you were from. And Yahweh said to Moses in Midian, go, return to Egypt, because all the men have died who were seeking your life. And Moses took his wife and his sons, Gershom and Eleazar, and had them ride on the donkey to Egypt. Who else has rode on a donkey? Interesting. There's so many parallels here that you start to go, oh wow, okay. Bethlehem, Mary, Joseph and Mary from Bethlehem to Egypt to escape, the King Herod's killing of the innocents. And Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. He's walking along this route. He's got the kids and his wife with him. And they come to the first rest stop. And Yahweh says to Moses, when you go to return to Egypt, see all of the wonders that I have put in your hand, and do them before Pharaoh, and I myself will harden his heart, and he will not release the people. Well, you just read me the end of the book. If you're going to harden his heart, why are we going to do all this anyway? Because God has a usefulness for the hardening of Pharaoh's heart to try and prepare the the Israelite people for their leaving. This has to be done. There is a definite order in which this must occur, or else the Israelites wouldn't have left. It has to go down this way. And you must say to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. And I said to you, hold on. What did Pharaoh say to do? What was how did he try to exterminate Moses? Killing the babies. Now, who did God just say was his firstborn? Israel. Do you see the parallel? It should be like jumping off the page at you going, no wonder God was mad. Not only were they killing the babies, but now you're abusing his firstborn, Israel. So this is a daddy mad. Does that make sense? But, sir? No, what he's talking about there is metaphorically, he's saying Israel's my firstborn and that they are my chosen. They're the one that I called out to be my chosen people. And I said, release my son and let him serve me, but you refuse to release him. Look, I am about to kill your son, your firstborn. God just fast forwards all the way forward for him. That's what he was going to say to Pharaoh. I skipped 22. And you must say to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. And I said to you, release my son and let him serve me. But you refuse to release him. Look, I'm about to kill your son, your firstborn. God's already telling Moses, even though Moses doesn't comprehend the plague of the Passover yet. Do you see that? So God's ready to head for him. And on the way, at the place of overnight lodging, at the first rest stop, Yahweh encountered Moses and sought to kill Moses. What do you mean? You told me to go, I'm going. I resisted you, and then I gave in. Then Aaron's here, and I'm now going. Why are you going to kill me now? And we get the glimpse into what Moses has learned and what he did not do at the birth of Gershom. But Zipporah took a flint knife. This is where we skip, like they leave parts of, this is like part of the storyline that is just getting skipped real fast. Moses obviously chose not to, and deliberately chose not to, circumcise Gershom. As an Israelite, you're supposed to circumcise every male child within 7 days or 8 days, I can't remember. 8 days? 8 days. You're supposed to circumcise those children. And now he's been in disobedience to that. Now, Zipporah, for whatever reason, doesn't like this at all. I mean, she gets super mad. And Moses, obviously, reading in between the lines here, Moses says to her, God's going to kill me if I don't circumcise this kid. And what I hear in my head is Zipporah going, you ain't touching him. Not with a knife. You're not touching our boy. He says, no, you don't understand. God's fixing to kill me. I have to circumcise him. You're not going to do it. I'll take care of it. You old rough as a cob. I think of my daddy. He was rough as a cob, you know. I can't imagine him feeding me a baby bottle. He'd have just soon, here's a cup, son. That's the kind of what I'm thinking about. She must have been like, fine, if it's got to be done, I'll do it. So she goes and she circumcises Gershom, and she cut off the foreskin of her son, and she touched his feet and said, she touched his feet there is Moses' feet. She touches Moses' feet and she says to him, yes, you're a bridegroom of blood to me. And he left him alone. God left Moses alone at that point. And at that time she said, a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. And you're like, whoa, that woman was mad. Now, I would advocate to you that I think she leaves him. Don't know this factually. As I read through Scripture, I think she leaves Moses shortly after this time. Because we do not see Zipporah and Gershom and Eleazar in Egypt that I have seen yet. Okay? That I can find from any other part of Scripture. And we actually see where Jethro later on brings her and the boys back to Moses once they get in the desert. But they're at odds with one another. They're not happy. And Yahweh said to Aaron, flip the scene, and Yahweh said to Aaron, go to the desert and meet Moses. And he went and encountered him at the mountain of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of Yahweh who had sent him and all the signs that he had commanded him. It's like a rewind. We're actually seeing it's like scenes. We see Moses fast forward as he's moving toward Egypt, and then all of a sudden it's like the author comes back and says, hey, I want to tell you one more thing I forgot to tell you about when Aaron came to meet Moses at the burning bush kind of thing. And so that's kind of the image we get. And Moses and Aaron went and they gathered all the elders of the Israelites. So who's with Moses on the road back to Egypt? Aaron. And so Aaron's traveling with him. Can you imagine that conversation whenever Zipporah left? Woo, she was hot, wasn't she? Aaron's like, man, I wouldn't want to go home with her tonight. And Moses is like, I ain't. She can go back to her daddy. I ain't putting up with that all the way to Egypt. You know, you get that, you see almost this kind of Aaron and Moses are now going to go do this. And Aaron spoke all the words that Yahweh had spoken to Moses, and he did the signs before the eyes of the people. What signs? The snake, the hand, and the blood. He did the signs before all the people, and the people believed when they heard that Yahweh had attended to the Israelites and that he had seen their misery, and they knelt down and they worshiped. Who? Why would you kneel down before Aaron and Moses? Unless you thought Moses to be a god of some kind, right? I mean, yeah, more, yeah, maybe. And so now we see Moses and Aaron begin to interact. Now we transition, and we're going to stop here tonight because I got quite a bit to cover there. How do you feel about that text, considering a profile of Moses? Do you feel a little bit different about Moses?
So going back to the very first question, I believe it was, how did Moses know about his history of background?
Yes.
Religion? I may be wrong, but see, I thought when Pharaoh's daughter found Moses, okay, that her maidservant asked, should I go get a mother that can nurse?
That's right.
And I always assumed that it was, that she knew who Moses' mother was, so she wouldn't got it.
We don't know for sure. That is a possibility, though, 100%. His sister Miriam, I'll go get a wet nurse for you. And got the mom, that's right. Yeah. And we know that Moses, obviously, if she was nursing him, how long? I mean, you literally see babies could be nursed till 4, 5, 6. I mean, I'm not trying to, I mean, literally that could happen. So there is maybe there was something that was given to him, but how much does a 4, 5, or 6-year-old remember about the religion they were taught by their parents?
I mean, here again, I just figured that she was his caretaker through, a certain point in his life.
Yeah.
An older point in his life.
We don't see that in Scripture. We don't know that for sure. Yes.
Same question. Do you think it might be because he was living around the Hebrew community?
Yeah.
So he might be living around that culture when he was.
There could, and that's very well, because him being in Pharaoh's household, he was probably taught to interact with the Hebrew people. And so he could have learned it absolutely in that way as well. Just like we would study the Muslim faith or Jehovah's Witness or whatever, we know a little bit about it, right? I mean, all right. Yeah. And he could. He could. I haven't seen that very often, but it is possible. Any other comments? Anything strike you that tonight you said, Chad, I've never thought about that before? I'd just be interested because there were many things as I was preparing. I thought, I've never seen that before. Anything tonight that y'all saw?
Never thought about it until you brought it up. I'm probably going to read your text and just read right through it. Never thought you had 2 lives. And second, I was thinking, when I first started with that, I was like, okay, Pharaoh ordered all the males to be killed and thrown into the Nile, correct?
Yes.
And he put it in the Nile where all the babies are floating around, they're dead. I mean,
Quite possible.
And then I'm thinking, why were they going down to the Nile for all the water, wherever they were doing anyway?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the
It's just gross.
Pharaoh and all and stuff.
Yeah. Say what now? He didn't. He just had support. Ah. It's white. It's not. Yeah, that's interesting. The if you look back, let's just look for just a second. What verse is that, Kelly? tell. And that was again, put your hand in the fold, and he brought his hand out, and disease was
Skin disease like snow.
snow falling. Yeah. So it's leprosy is skin disease is what you see. To be leprous. That's interesting. So it is. That's one of the ways it could be. It was. Leprosy was a wide range. Yeah. When we studied New Testament, you're exactly right, Wyatt. Leprosy, they knew what it looked like, but the skin could be discolored, and they would, mark it pre-leprous or whatever, that kind of thing. That's right. That's right. They did. They did have leprosy in their home. It was black mold, essentially.
So if Moses and Aaron had the same mother, somewhere down the road, I mean, I just thought that we never saw each other as children.
Yeah, we don't know for sure. There was an awareness of one another, though. That's kind of cool. I don't know for sure. I don't recall. I don't recall.
The firstborn is the one that we're trying to kill.
But if he was older.
But he was older. He would have been past that age. Male children. Yeah, it was just any male child at that point. After that time. We just don't know for sure. All right. That's good Bible study.